Assalamu alaikum, guys. So the next thing we talked about in class was examining a source. So we looked at two types of sources, primary source and secondary source, and how do we analyze those sources to see if those sources are accurate. That's internal consistency or an external consistency. So we can do those kind of checks like we did with the letter to Paris to see if do we trust this source or not. So the first thing we looked at was a letter to Paris. Was it a primary source or secondary source? It was indeed a primary source. And then we kind of went through some checks to see if was it internally consistent and then was it externally consistent. Okay? So when we move here, primary sources, we talked about our firsthand information about an event. It was created at that moment, at that time. So it's words, images, objects that are created by persons directly involved in an event. Okay? It does not include an analysis or interpretation of those sources. So we talked about how the buildings downtown, they were created at the time. So they're basically primary sources of what architecture looked like at the time. We talked about how maps, charts, photographs, letters, diaries, those types of things are basically records and examples of primary sources. They were created at the time of the event, okay? So then we talked about secondary sources. Now, secondary sources are secondhand information. They are not created by people who were eyewitnesses to the event. So it was someone that told somebody else that was not there, okay? So an example is a written analysis of old firsthand interviews about an event. So somebody, basically we give an example about how if I wanted to know something that happened in the lunchroom, I may ask a couple different students, I may ask a couple different teachers. I wasn't there in the lunchroom though. So those people were primary sources, but I would be a secondary source. So if I went to go tell Sister Ghazala about something that happened in the lunchroom, I wasn't there. So after collecting all these experiences and kind of analyzing them, and then my story to Sister Ghazala would be considered a secondary source, okay? Another example is a book that describes an event written many years after that particular event. So that's most likely like our textbooks, like many other books that we read today. So we kind of did this quick check your understanding. Imagine you're a historian who wants to know what American middle school students learned from 1950 to 2000. Which of the following would be considered a secondary source? So an interview with a neighbor of a person who has a middle school teacher in the 1950s, an article written in 2010 about middle school in 1960s, a final exam from a social studies class in 1980, or a textbook about the history of middle school education. Now, we talked about how basically that in this particular question, an interview would be considered a primary source because they were there, who was a teacher in the 1950s. So he was middle school teacher and he was there. An article written in 2010 about the middle school in 1960s. Now that would be considered a secondary source. Why? Because the article was written in 2010, right? That is past 2000. Okay, so it was not written in that time and at that time. Okay, a final exam from the social studies class in 1980. Now we talked about how that's a primary source because this final exam was created in the 1980s, which is in the time period that we are curious about. And then a textbook about the history of middle school education. Well, this would also be considered a secondary source unless it was a textbook that they were using in that time. So this one's a little bit vague, but if it's about the history of middle school education and it was written past 2000 or before 1950s, then that would be considered a secondary source. So it's not in the time that we are interested in. So we didn't really talk about fact and opinion because this is something that you guys have talked about in previous grades, but a fact is something that is true about a subject that can be tested or proven, and an opinion is what someone thinks about a subject. Then we talked about internal and external consistencies or inconsistencies. So an internal we talked about is within a single document, in one document. So in a letter to Paris, we're looking at only that letter. Okay, we're not looking anywhere else, or in one speech that we're looking at, we're only looking at that one speech. Then we're going to see if anything contradicts. That means that they clash with each other. Is it consistent? Is everything makes sense in that one letter? So when we looked at A Letter to Paris, we talked about how we didn't really know where he was. He said he was in Philadelphia, but then later he said he was in Paris, or it was dated that it was in Paris. So we're not really sure where he was, and that is considered a contradiction, which is then considered an inconsistency. So when the facts that are presented are not really consistent with each other. So then we might think, well, do we then trust this source? Is it an accurate source? Okay. So we gave these two examples. A diary entry states that John went to school on Monday, and then later says that John and Mary went to school on Monday. Is this inconsistent? No, because John could have gone to school on Monday, and then it says John and Mary went to school on Monday. So they're really saying the same thing. It's just the second part is adding more information. So now you know John went to school on Monday, but then you also know that Mary went to school on Monday. It's not really contradicting, right? They're not clashing with each other. However, when we looked at this one, a diary says that John went to school on Monday, and then later states that John never went to school. So now we have a contradiction. These two parts of information clash with each other. A diary says John went to school on Monday, and then later in the same diary, it says that John never went to school. So now we have an inconsistency, okay? So the most important part here is we're looking at the same diary, okay? And then we're looking at if information in that diary is consistent, okay? One source, one diary, whether or not the information is consistent. Next, we looked at external inconsistencies or contradictions. So external means we're comparing multiple sources, multiple documents. Nowadays, we can go on Google and search whether or not something is true, right? So if we want to say a speech was given on this particular date, well, we can do an external check and check Google and say, well, Google, I want to know if it's true. Was this speech given on this date? Okay. That would be an external check because you are looking at another source outside of the source that you're reading. Okay. So then we're going to look at these two examples. So the first example is a diary entry states that John went to school on Monday. An interview with another student indicates that John and Mary went to school on Monday. So now you're looking at one, a diary, and then two, an interview. Are they saying the same thing? Yes, they are. Both of them say that John went to school on Monday. So this would be an external consistency. Everything checks out. Everything makes sense. Okay. They're both saying the same thing. Number two, a diary says that John went to school on Monday, but school attendance records show that John never went to school. Now we have a contradiction, right? The two facts from the two different sources are clashing with each other. So they both cannot be true, okay? He either went to school or he didn't go to school. So the diary is either right or the attendance records are right, okay? So basically this shows an inconsistency. So then you have to check, well, which one is right, okay? So when we look at historical sources and historical accounts, we have to check, first, is it a primary or secondary source, okay? And then we have to check, is there any contradictions within that source or any contradictions when we look outside the source to check whether or not those things are true, right? So basically, we practiced that on A Letter to Paris. And I know it was a little difficult to understand at first. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me in class or email me, and we'll go over it again, inshallah, in class. Jazakallah khair.